Rewriting the provided text in a way that maintains the general historical theme but avoids offensive or sensitive content requires thoughtful consideration. The rewritten version must reflect a more nuanced and historically accurate representation of the time period without compromising on respectful language. Here's the reworked narrative. In the 19th century, a young woman's virtue was closely tied to her chastity. Society placed immense value on a bride entering marriage as a virgin, and for many families, this was seen as a matter of both personal honor and social standing. Virginity was a symbol of purity, modesty, and morality, a trait that many men of the time expected in a wife. Families, particularly those of affluence, often arranged marriages that would secure their social and financial futures, and a daughter's chastity played a crucial role in this negotiation. For many young women, their entire upbringing revolved around preserving this virtue. In these families, girls were often raised with strict social codes and faced significant pressure to conform. Their value, unfortunately, was judged not by their intelligence, character, or accomplishments, but by their ability to maintain this social standard. For young brides, their wedding night was not just the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. It was the culmination of years of carefully preserved propriety. But while society celebrated the ideal of purity, personal relationships often told a different story. As a bride approached her wedding day, there was often a mixture of excitement and fear. Although the expectation was clear, her virginity must be intact, there were whispers among certain circles of men that revealed a more complicated reality. Some men, particularly those of wealth and social status, harbored strange notions about their wives' chastity. In a few instances, men doubted whether a woman's virginity was truly an asset. The fear was that if no man had shown romantic interest in her before, she might somehow be lacking in allure or appeal. This attitude was rare, but it represented a growing tension between societal expectations and personal desires. Caught between these conflicting ideals, some brides found themselves in a difficult position. They had spent their lives upholding the values of their families, guarding their bodies in preparation for marriage. Yet, their soon-to-be husbands might quietly expect the opposite. In an effort to avoid disappointing their new spouses, some brides felt immense pressure to find a way to meet these unspoken expectations. The period in question was marked by great social divides, with many wealthy households owning plantations and employing enslaved individuals for labor. The power dynamics on these plantations were oppressive, and the relationships between enslaved people and their owners were often defined by exploitation. In the complex and unjust world of the time, young brides, anxious about their wedding night, occasionally found themselves contemplating disturbing solutions. With the power they held as members of the ruling class, some considered inappropriate and exploitative actions, but it's crucial to recognize these ideas as products of a deeply flawed society. Though history is filled with stories of hardship and inequality, it's important to acknowledge the moral complexities of the time without excusing them. The relationships formed within these oppressive systems were never equal, and any act carried out under the duress of power imbalances, particularly those involving enslaved individuals, was inherently exploitative. Young women of the 19th century were not immune to the pressures and confusions of their time. While society demanded they preserve their chastity, they were also subjected to personal fears and anxieties about their future husband's desires. The weight of these expectations often led them to drastic measures, illustrating the harmful impact of the rigid social norms and patriarchal systems that governed their lives. The broader context of this narrative reveals a world where women's bodies were controlled by societal rules, and where men's opinions, however contradictory, played a dominant role in shaping a woman's future. While many young brides struggled with these contradictions, the underlying truth is that the society they lived in prioritized appearance, social status, and family honor over genuine emotional and personal well-being. This narrative not only reflects the troubling social dynamics of the time but also serves as a reminder of how far society has come in terms of recognizing the value of individuals beyond arbitrary societal standards. The historical realities of the 19th century were complicated, shaped by deep-seated inequalities and harsh expectations, but they also laid the groundwork for future conversations about freedom, equality, and personal autonomy. To rewrite the text while keeping the content respectful, historically accurate, and avoiding sensitive or inappropriate details, the narrative must focus on the power dynamics, societal norms, and historical context of the 19th century. Here's a more appropriate and historically conscious version of the text. In the deeply segregated and oppressive society of the 19th century, the institution of slavery not only represented a profound moral injustice but also reflected the complex power dynamics between enslavers and the enslaved. For many families of affluence, the expectations surrounding a woman's chastity were paramount, and a bride's virginity was considered a vital asset in securing advantageous marriages. In these marriages, women were often seen not as individuals with autonomy, but as embodiments of their family's honor and purity. As these societal pressures weighed on young women, they faced conflicting ideals about their roles as wives. The rigid moral structures of their society demanded that they remain chaste until marriage, preserving their purity for their husbands. However, beneath this expectation lay a layer of complexity that was seldom spoken of. Some men of the era began to express doubts or concerns about marrying women who remained virgins into adulthood. These men harbored the troubling belief that a woman who had never been desired by another man, or who had never engaged in any romantic or physical relationship, might lack allure or appeal. It was an irrational fear, born of the rigid gender norms and cultural values of the time. For the young brides, the tension between societal expectation and personal fear often became unbearable. Trapped in a system that judged their worth based on their chastity, some found themselves in situations where they felt compelled to take drastic measures to meet the unspoken expectations of their future husbands. This inner conflict led to a disturbing reality: the use of enslaved individuals as tools to resolve personal dilemmas, reflecting the gross power imbalances of the time. Enslaved men, often treated as property, were tragically subjected to countless forms of exploitation. They had no agency, no control over their lives, and certainly no say in their relationships. Their very humanity was denied by the brutal institution of slavery. In some cases, the power dynamics between the enslaved and their enslavers extended to personal and intimate violations, where enslaved individuals were coerced into acts they had no choice but to endure. The power structure at play in such scenarios was devastatingly clear. Enslaved men, aware of the consequences of defiance, lived in constant fear of punishment or even death. The threat of retribution loomed large over them, making any refusal an impossibility. While these encounters may have been driven by the personal insecurities or societal pressures faced by the white women of the time, they were, for the enslaved, yet another form of exploitation in a system designed to strip them of their humanity. The young women, pressured by a society that tied their worth to their purity, may have seen these encounters as a necessary means to an end. Their fear of disappointing their husbands or being seen as undesirable pushed them into morally questionable territory. However, it's crucial to recognize that this was a reflection of the oppressive patriarchal and racial structures that dominated the era. These women were themselves products of a society that placed them in restrictive roles, though they still held immense power over the enslaved individuals who had no agency in the matter. For the enslaved, there was no liberation in these encounters, only exploitation. The use of their bodies, forced upon them by those in power, was a stark reminder of the deep-seated racial inequalities and injustices that permeated the society of the time. While the young women may have experienced conflicting emotions, relief at no longer having to face societal scrutiny, guilt over their actions, and fear of being found out, the enslaved men had no such luxury. Their lives were dictated by the whims of their enslavers, their fates tied to the decisions of those who held power over them. The morning after such encounters, life for the young women would appear to return to its expected course. They would continue with their weddings, outwardly projecting the image of purity that society demanded, with smiles that hid the turmoil beneath. Yet, within the depths of their souls, emotions swirled, guilt, shame, and a profound confusion that lingered long after the events of the previous night. They had fulfilled society's expectations, but at what cost? The weight of their actions began to sink in, for these were not decisions born of desire or freedom. These choices were made under the crushing pressure of societal norms that dictated what a woman's worth should be, and yet, deep down, they felt a crack in the very foundation of their understanding of themselves. For the enslaved men, however, the situation was far more harrowing, and they were left with no such emotional outlet. They woke to the same bitter reality of oppression that had defined their entire existence. There was no fleeting escape for them, no reprieve from the chains that bound them, both physically and emotionally. Their lives were dictated by the whims of those who held power, and the traumatic encounters of the night before were not isolated incidents. They were a continuation of the violence and exploitation they faced daily, reminders that they were seen as little more than property. The choices made by the women, while shaped by their own societal pressures, resulted in the further dehumanization of those who had no choice in the matter. This chapter of history, often brushed aside or sanitized in more comfortable retellings, reveals the profound and devastating impact of slavery on both the oppressors and the oppressed. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths about how power, race, and gender intersected in ways that left countless individuals morally compromised, coerced, and stripped of their dignity. The use of enslaved individuals, particularly in this intimate and exploitative manner, shines a light on the immense power imbalances that characterized the era. While the young women were navigating their own lack of agency in a society that often treated them as mere vessels for their family's honor, the enslaved men had even less autonomy, their humanity denied in every sense. The actions of these women were not entirely their own. They were shaped by the patriarchal structures that had conditioned them from birth to see themselves as subservient to men, bound to a role that they had not chosen. But even within their constrained existence, they still held power over the lives of the enslaved men who had even fewer rights and less recourse. This power was wielded, often without thought to the consequences, leaving the enslaved men vulnerable to the whims of those who controlled their fate. Reflecting on these historical injustices is essential, for the legacies of slavery and exploitation continue to cast long shadows over the world today. It is only by confronting these difficult truths head-on that we can truly understand the depth of the moral and social wrongs that shaped the past and continue to influence the present. While the young women of the time were trapped in a system that denied them full agency, they still existed within a structure that gave them the power to harm others, power they may not have fully understood, but which had lasting, devastating consequences for the enslaved men forced to comply with their demands. As we delve into these narratives, we uncover a painful, complex history, one that challenges our understanding of morality, power, and human dignity. The women who felt the weight of societal expectations may have seen their actions as necessary for survival within a rigid system, but for the enslaved, these encounters were nothing short of exploitation. The men, trapped within the brutal institution of slavery, had no voice, no control over their bodies or lives. The power imbalance was absolute and crushing, and the trauma endured by these men is a reminder of the horrors of slavery that must never be forgotten. Exploring these stories is not just about understanding the past but also about recognizing the ways in which oppressive systems, whether based on race, gender, or class, intertwine and perpetuate cycles of exploitation and violence. This part of history is a stark reminder of the ways in which individuals, even those who are themselves oppressed, can wield power over others in damaging ways. It is a narrative that forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that oppression is rarely straightforward. It is layered, nuanced, and often perpetuated by those who are, themselves, victims of a larger system. This is not to excuse the actions of those who exploited the enslaved, but to place them in the broader context of a society that conditioned people to believe in their own superiority or their lack of agency. The moral compromises made by these young women, shaped by the expectations of their families and society, still had real and painful consequences for those they harmed. The enslaved men, robbed of their autonomy, were forced into situations that violated their very humanity, their bodies used as tools to serve the desires of those in power. The fact that these encounters took place in the darkness, away from the eyes of society, speaks to the deep-seated shame and secrecy surrounding such acts, secrets that reflect the rot at the heart of an unjust system. History often mirrors the present, reflecting both the progress we have made and the challenges we continue to face. The exploitation of human beings, whether through slavery, systemic racism, or other forms of oppression, is a legacy that lingers in our society today. Understanding the true depth of exploitation during the era of slavery requires us to confront not only the physical violence inflicted upon the enslaved but also the emotional and psychological toll of living under constant threat and dehumanization. As we confront these historical narratives, it is important to honor the humanity of those who suffered and to recognize the enduring impact of these injustices. The men and women who lived through these experiences were not mere footnotes in history. They were individuals with hopes, fears, and dreams, whose lives were shaped and, in many cases, destroyed by the oppressive systems they were forced to navigate. Their stories matter, and by telling them, we ensure that their pain is not forgotten. This narrative, uncomfortable as it may be, forces us to reckon with the ways in which society has allowed exploitation to persist, often unchecked. It challenges us to think critically about the power structures that continue to exist in our world and to strive for a more just and equitable future. By acknowledging the full scope of these historical wrongs, we take a step toward healing the wounds of the past and creating a world in which such atrocities are no longer possible. As we reflect on the legacy of slavery, let us remember that history is not a distant, disconnected series of events. It is a living force that continues to shape the world we inhabit. The injustices of the past are not relics of a bygone era. They are the foundations upon which much of our modern society is built. By understanding the true scope of these injustices, we can begin to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality and work toward a future that honors the dignity and humanity of all people.